let me just say hello to everybody and good evening on this Sunday evening, and it's great to have you here. I would like to thank you on behalf of TIGA. That's the name of our Center for Global and Area Studies. And this is our first semester of a series of webinars that we are going to have this year. I mean, last year we had lots of seminars, but this year we are starting a new series of webinars, and they are merely concentrate on the issue of Islamic religious education in Europe. So we are going to start with Britain today, and then we will have a follow-up with about Germany and then France. We will also have some workshops, hopefully face-to-face in the summer, related to the same issues about Islamic religious education and the challenges in these countries. Today, we have a distinguished guest from Britain. It's Dr. Islamuddin. Dr. Islamuddin is an imam and a lecturer at the Private Islamic Institute in London, and he teaches classical and contemporary Islamic studies, and he has various presentations on traditional and modern understanding of religious texts, on multiculturalism and also universal human rights. And he holds a PhD degree in law and did his research on Muslim marriage and divorce in Britain. And he also completed his master's in Islamic studies. Okay, and for those who are not able to attend or who would like to watch the presentation later, we will air it also on YouTube. Okay, you will be able to find this video on YouTube too. Okay, so Dr. Islamuddin, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this presentation.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So before, how are you, first of all?
How are you doing? Considering the condition. Yeah, considering the situation we're facing with this pandemic. So, alhamdulillah, all I can say is praise to God that we are well at the moment. But our thoughts and prayers are for those that are currently being affected by the coronavirus. We know the news currently that there are many people that are poorly because of this. So we ask that Allah grant some shifa, cure, and patience to their family. Amen.
Inshallah. Okay, so let's have a general overview of what is going on in Britain related to Islamic religious education. Could you give us an idea of how things are managed, how the community is working, etc.?
Yes, I would. I mean, for that purpose, I've got a small presentation which I'd like to deliver to our audience today. So first and foremost, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So we start with this presentation. The topic, as you can see, is understanding Islamic religious education in Britain. So the topic is about Britain. So for those who have joined us from the UK, you will be familiar with the text I'm going to present. So I would say just bear with us, patience. It's mainly for audience outside of UK to give you a general overview so that we can then go and discuss in more detail the topic of Islamic religious education. So when we think of Britain, we have to understand that when we talk about Muslims in Britain, we have a long-standing history of Muslims migrating, the presence of Muslims in the UK. In fact, it goes back to the 1800s. And as you're all aware, those who have studied history, the British Empire spanned the world, conquered a lot of the Muslim world as we know. And then later on, once these states gained independence, they became part of the Commonwealth. One of the things we find when it comes to migration of Muslims in the UK, we find that post 1945, after the Second World War, there was a call for people to come and support the British Isle in regards to manpower. So a lot of people came from these Commonwealth countries, these former colonies and territories of the United Kingdom. So we find in most cases they came as migrants, economic migrants, for work purposes. And then we find in the 1970s and therefore after that the unification of families meant that we find women and children now in Britain. So I'm presenting this information purely because the topic is talking about Islamic religious education. And we can imagine the necessity for religious education came when there was children, families here to have some sort of formal Islamic education. So the population currently, according to the last census, which is about 10 years ago, 2.7 million Muslims. It's still a minority, but a significant minority. And we assume that in the coming year, this year here, actually, when the new census is done, it's going to be above 3 million. Considering the population UK is not as big as some of the other European countries, it's still a significant minority. So here in this map, as you can see where the dark green areas are, these are, for example, areas where there's heavy concentration of Muslims. So you can see the map shows England from the north down to the south. There are areas where there are pockets of Muslim community. And that's important for us to understand. Why? Because look to this. Where Muslims come, there is an identity that is associated with them. And first and foremost, when we think about the Muslim community anywhere in the world, it's our masajid or the mosque that we find. So in the UK is no different to any other place where there are Muslims, especially in the diaspora, where the heart and the hub of the community becomes the mosque. So we have here, as you can see, a date here, 1889. This is the mosque in Woking in Surrey, which is considered one of the first mosques in the UK. It's built in the time when the British Raj was still, they're still in charge of India and so on. So there we have one of the oldest mosques there. And then down the bottom, what I've shown is 2019, a mosque in Cambridge, the central mosque, which is called the Eco Mosque, to show how it's evolved. And it's renowned for the fact that it's used timber. It relies on a lot of this, eco energy and so on. So we have these mosques, and 1,500 mosques, according to one survey, scattered around the country. Now, not all of those mosques are going to be as grand as some of the mosques that we can see in the pictures here. For example, on the top, if you look to the top right-hand side, that is the Suleymaniye Mosque, which is in North London, where Turkish community established this mosque. Then next to it, we see on the top there, the Regent's Park Mosque, which is in the central London and often has a committee which is supported by Arab imams. And then we go further down and we can see, for example, East London Mosque, which is in the middle and towards the right, which is pretty much in the heart of the British Bangladeshi Muslim community. It's one of the largest mosques in the UK. And there's a picture here next to it, just to show you, look, this is a Yorkshire, which is a northern city, which are full of terrace houses. And then as you get to the end, you find this huge mosque, which is the Leeds Mosque, the Mecca Mosque, and that is part of British society. So, when we go up and down the country, there are mosques scattered everywhere, some grand like this and some very small. So when we think about Muslims in Britain, it's important as an overview just to understand how much we as a community are part of the British society. So one of the things which was one of the problems initially when Muslims arrived in the UK was the issue of halal food. Halal food is not a problem now. Okay, the other issue, for example, just underneath the halal food, we find there's a picture here of a cemetery, so Muslim cemetery. So Muslims, when they die, they're buried in their own cemeteries. So their facility is made like this. But the significant thing I want to point out here is that if we look to these photos of these different people here, we have Muslims who are part of the political system, so they're part of the ruling as well as a shadow government and shadow cabinets and so on. They're part of the political system as MPs. We have in the center here, for example, we have mayors of city. And then at the bottom, we have when they're working in services, for example, it's normally accepted that there's doctors and nurses, but also Muslims are part of the police force, part of the fire service, and so on. So Muslims are part and parcel, basically the fabric of British society. And I want us to appreciate this as part of the overview. So now the question is, when we talk about Islamic education, okay, education is obviously very important in every country. And in the UK, for example, the Department of Education runs all the facilities and all the curriculum and marking and so on in regards to education. And in the UK, it is compulsory, okay, from the age of 5 to 18 for every citizen to have education. So 5 to 18. Initially, it was up to the age of 16, but now they made it 18. So even previously, they used to say at the age of 16, you could leave, become a school leaver. But now they say, no, up to the age of 18. So if you leave school, you have to be doing some sort of vocational course, some sort of apprenticeship. So a legal requirement here. Okay, so we're looking at the social legal situation of Muslims that live in the UK. Legally, they have to educate their children. Now, here we have something known as the national curriculum. It's not that you can just educate them as you want. So this regards to the Islamic education that we want to teach our children. No, the law says that they need to study, for example, these core subjects, for example, English, maths, science, and so on, as you can see in this list. Okay, nowhere do we actually see Islamic education as a core subject. So for us to introduce as Muslims Islamic education, this becomes something supplementary or something we we're intertwined with regards to the current system. But one of the things that they do say in the UK, which is important, is that religious education regarding all of the stages. So briefly, just go back to that slide. These are the different key stages. They said at all of the stages here, it's important that children, they receive religious education. Now, quite recently, we found in our secondary school, which is what you would normally call high school in other countries, there's been this controversy where our children are taught relationship and sex education. Okay, so these are children reaching puberty and so on. The school teaches them about sexual preferences and so on. So recently in the news, as you can see here in this photo, Muslim parents have protested saying, no, we don't want our children to be taught about, for example, gay sexual relationships. It's something that if they want to know, then we will tell them, but it's not for the school to tell them. And we can see this lady holding a poster saying, my child, my choice. My child, my choice. And this is talking about what is being taught in state schools, not in Muslim schools. So overview here, I'm not going to go quickly through this because I'm sure Dr. Chima would ask me more about this, but Islamic education, this is a point I want to come, is not part of the national curriculum. It's not part of, for example, the government policy to teach it, even though it has a substantial minority of Muslims, to say, oh, we take it upon ourselves because you are Muslims and a part of our citizenship, that we will now serve you for your particular needs, which is the Islamic education. No, rather we find Islamic education is something that we as a community have to take on board ourselves. So the options are maybe faith-based schools. So you have these full-time schools that will supplement what the government wants them to teach, as well as Islamic curriculum. Or what is more common is that, because the majority of the children in this country, maybe up to 85% or more, they go to state-funded schools, which means education is free in this country. So what they would do is rather they would go to supplementary schools, which is like madrasas and maktabs, evenings or weekend. And these schools, their primary focus is memorization of the Quran or reading of the Quran, and some portions of the Arabic language, but actually just linked to reading the Quran. So here is an example. I've just taken a random example, not because I want to focus on the school itself. It's an example I've taken because it's publicly available to show you, look, this is an Islamic school. And on the top, it puts all of these sort of awards. And look, it even highlights the fact that it's, the governing body that goes and checks the quality of Islamic, not Islamic education, general education in all schools. Ofsted is there. So, they're working with the national curriculum and the inspectors, which is Ofsted. So they proudly advertise, look, Ofsted come and visit us, and they've given us a grade, an award of being a good school. And again, they're promoting the Mayor of London. By the way, those who are not from the UK, the Mayor of London is someone who's Muslim as well. So they proudly promote this. But when we look to the curriculum, what do we see? It is mainly national curriculum, which is the topics that we expect all schools. So when we see Arabic and Islamiyat written there, we know that is not actually part of the national curriculum, but they've maybe taken this as an option. For example, where it allows you to study a language, to put that in there. So what is then Islamic education? What is Islamic education? So what makes this different from other curriculum? So here what we see is the topics like Arabic, Tajweed, Fiqh, which is jurisprudence, Aqidah, which is theology, Seerah, the biography of the Prophet. So we find these sort of topics are what is considered as the Islamic curriculum. And we find that here, they say the aim of teaching these topics is, I'm just going to list a few, but we can come back to this, is basically that the student should have God consciousness, okay? And we can see, look, a student should be a sound alim or hafiz, okay? So someone who's an Islamic scholar or one who has memorized the Quran. And towards the end, it says a balanced education and someone who is productive British citizenship, okay? But to get this Islamic curriculum, you have to pay, excuse the typo, there should be fees, £3,200 per annum. So the state will not pay for this. You have to pay for this yourself. So coming towards the end of the brief overview that I want to give you, how do other people perceive Islamic education? So that is us previously talking about Islamic education within the Muslim community and how we facilitate it for our community. But look, recently and within the last decade or so, we find quite a few incidents have happened which has brought the Muslim identity into sort of disrepute. For example, recently the government said Islamophobia, which is this rooted racism, which is like you target people who express that they're Muslimness, okay? And the government came up with this. Why? Because this perception that if you show yourself as being Muslim, you're other and you're a threat to the society. So here's a few examples which we can probably come to later, is where mainstream schools are being thought to be taken over by Muslims. So for example, governors and so on. And in other cases where we see this niqab picture here, is we find a threat seen, a security threat, when students who, you know, in this country have the choice to wear the niqab, though it is a minority opinion that people follow, again, is looked as being something that is a security risk. And where does this come from? It comes from the issue that you know, we need to prevent, at the bottom here, as you can see, prevent terrorism or anything that leads to terrorism and attacking the British Isles. So I'm not going to go any further, and I can come back to this point. I think looking forward, some of the things that we may discuss now is what is Islamic education? Because if we got Islamic schools that are teaching pretty much what national curriculum does, so what makes a subject Islamic? For example, what is Islamic social science? Then we look to the Islamic schools, because there is an internal discussion about Muslims as to what Islamic education should be. So are the schools in the first place addressing the differing view among the Muslim community about what Islamic education should be, and are they providing the curriculum as well? Okay, because one of the things about the Muslim community, because of the diverse origins of the Muslims in this country, that for example, they will bring different input as to what is Islamic education and what is part of the Islamic curriculum. Can the state play a role in Islamic education? Up to date, they haven't, but if there's going to be 3 to 4 million Muslims in the UK, should the state play a role in Islamic education? Because, you know, if they allow you to have religious freedom, then part of that freedom surely should be to be able to have Islamic education. And then the last point maybe we can address is the issue of public perception of Islamic education. So going back to those media stories where sometimes it is sensationalized, that Muslims are seen as the other, so it's them versus us. So that's a brief overview. Hopefully we can touch upon some of these points a bit later when Dr. Chima maybe inquires about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Necmettin, for the overview. Now I will go back again, start maybe from the beginning and elaborate on several issues. But as I wrote in the chat section, if you have any comments or any questions, please write in the chat section. So we will have a Q&A session at the end, and you will be able to ask your questions there. Okay, so if we can go back to the Muslim community in Britain.
Yes.
You just briefly introduced them, that they especially came after the Second World War with the call of the British government. Could you give us a picture of the Muslim community in Britain, not just in terms of where they live and when they arrive, but what's the structure there, and who are the constituents of the Muslim community in Britain? I mean, when we look at France, when we look at Germany, there are differences, I would most probably say. So what's the case in the UK?
So what we find in the UK is that with regards to the different trends in migration, you find different communities come at different eras throughout the time. So we've, for example, going back to here, we mentioned that post 1945, we found certain countries, so workers came from certain countries to support the UK, especially with regards to manpower and workforce and so on. So we find in the 70s, we find majority of the people that came to the UK, they were from the Asian subcontinent. So you find, for example, newly formed Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, you find a majority came from that sort of region. And they formed the majority of the workforce. Thereafter, we find then in following decades that you find, for example, other communities come. So now you find that there are Arab Muslims in the community. There are, for example, African and North African Muslims. You find European Muslims. So, for example, Muslims from Bosnia, Kosovo, and so on. Turkish Muslims. Maybe initially the Turkish community was predominantly from the Turkish Cypriot community, the early migrants that were in the UK, but now you find even from the Turkish community. So what has this done? When we look to the trends in the Muslim community, when we look to the infrastructure, we find, for example, going back to the mosques, we find the early mosques were by the early communities that came here. So some of the large mosques that we saw was in the hands of the Asian subcontinent. So we find a lot of the mosque networks are predominantly, the committees are from the Asian subcontinent, but that's not to say that the new communities that have arrived, so you find the mosques, they can be Somali mosque, they can be, for example, Arab mosque and so on and so on. So the mosque, the main thing is that the community is very heterogeneous, very diverse. Okay, there is no one voice that speaks actually for the Muslim community. Rather, you find that if you go up and down the country, for example, you find pockets of communities that have a link to maybe some cultural aspect of the origin. For example, if you go to Leicester, and this not to generalize too much, but Leicester has a predominant, for example, Gujarati community. Okay, and if you go to Bradford, a predominantly Pakistani community. If you go to London, and certain parts of London are predominantly, for example, Bangladeshi community. But that's not to say, for example, in the north of London, there isn't a Turkish community, but there is. But every part of the UK has a different, for example, cultural aspect to it because of the dominant community that's settled in that part of the country. So they're very heterogeneous. It's not like one voice or one culture speaks for all of Muslims in the UK.
Is it possible to say that they are merely economic migrants?
I wouldn't say they are merely economic migrants, because initially they were economic migrants. One of the things about identity now is that when you have, for example, we use the term second generation and third generation migrants now, who feel that they're pretty much part and parcel of the fabric of the society. The sense of belonging is that, yes, our parents, maybe they came from abroad, but we are pretty much rooted in this country. Whereas the initial economic migrants that did come, they had a vision that initially that they would just work there and eventually return back, but that is not the case now. So I think using the term diaspora, though it is a terminology used inside sociology and is a relevance to the topic, but generally if you would speak to Muslims in the UK, those that have been here, say, who are now second generation or third generation, they're very much rooted with the identity of being British rather than, say, part British and part another country, for example.
Did the demands change in that sense? I mean, when we compare the first generation and the second or third generation in terms of Islamic education too?
Yes, I think definitely first generation, when they came, because they saw themselves as this stay here being temporary, they didn't actually think about anything beyond the bare necessity. So, for example, they felt Friday prayers. How do we establish Friday prayers or 5-time prayers in a Jama'ah? So mosques were one of the primary concerns. So we find the mosque network was one of the initial things that was set up. Then, for example, the need was for halal food. So there would be very few slaughterhouses that provided halal food or halal meat. So they procured this. So these were the primary concern. Then the other thing is, I give an example of if a Muslim were to die in this country, where do we bury them? I mean, in the first generations that came here, they would be buried in the same graveyard as, for example, people of other religions. So it could be a Christian graveyard or so on. But now they've procured their own area. So we have like only Muslim cemeteries, for example. And that is common. So that was the needs of the early generation. But the generations now is that we are pretty much here. We've been here for maybe 50 or 60 years. Our children are growing up here. Our grandchildren are growing up here, and they are pretty much part of this society. And there is a need because, the Islamic education, part of Islamic education is actually linked to identity. This sort of cultural identity, a sense of belonging to this unity of a faith. So there was this need to establish Islamic education. So maybe initially they started off in the mosque themselves, but then the question became, well, should it not be something that is full-time? So now we find faith-based school, they're found up and down the country where children can go in full-time and study there and do so within the law, because the law requires that you study full-time as well. So this is the difference in the need of Islamic education. Okay.
You already mentioned actually that there is not just one voice when we talk about the Muslim communities, that there are different communities with different backgrounds, different cultures, etc. So, I mean, the question is, though the answer is most probably obvious, but still, do they form a unity, or is the differentiation among them too big, or is the gap between them too big to form a unity? to have the same demands, to have the same aspirations, maybe?
I think what is very important here is, because there is no link to any say foreign political influence to practice a religion. Okay, so pretty much anybody who practices Islam in the UK will do from probably a sense of belonging or just out of personal choice. There is no overarching authority in the UK that tells you or represents, for example, the Muslim body in general. Okay, so you may find, for example, if a community is aligned to a certain part of the world, and then you'll find they will follow that school of thought or the scholars from that region and so on. But in general, people are free to practice as they wish, but because they have this sense of belonging to a certain identity. So you find, for example, this is a version of Islam we follow the scholars from that region or within that community that originates from that region. So you find that. So there is this diversity there because of the fact of the sense of belonging. There is that. Now, the question of unity, which you asked, okay, so the unity now becomes, so everyone's free to practice religion as they wish, and it has some uniformity because we pray, we fast. Ramadan is something that is, uniform for us. So Muslims in the UK, they share in that experience, but generally they can do within their own communities because we have communities, as you just rightly said. So the question of uniting would be when there is a cause, when there is a need. So one of the things that we don't have is we don't have, say, a mufti for the UK or Britain who will actually give a religious edit, a fatwa, if the situation occurs. Rather, people will go approach a scholar, and that scholar may serve all of the Muslim community with a certain opinion. For example, one of the things that is happening at the moment is people are wary of whether to take this vaccine, okay, the vaccine for the coronavirus, because does it have any elements of haram constituents? For example, anything in the product and so on, could it cause greater harm? So now the question is, there is no mufti here to give a fatwa to say to all the Muslims, take it. Rather, what has happened is confusion where some people will follow, for example, fake news and any report to say it's not allowed, and others say, no, this particular scholar said it's allowed, so we take it. So there's some confusion there regards this. So unity only when there's a requirement, but other than that, there is no overarching authority or organization.
Sometimes people speak of a European Islam or a British Islam. Is there such a thing like a British Islam? I mean, you talked about all the different schools, schools of thought, and also the muftis. They follow in a way, not in Britain, but maybe in their countries of origin. But still, people talk about a British Islam or of an Islam that is overarching the whole community in Britain. Is that true? Or is it possible?
Well, is it true or is it possible? Two questions we need to ask here. Firstly, is defining, because it's like we had a similar problem when it became a few years ago, regards to this part of Islam, where it was seen that if we didn't speak English, then that was a problem. So all of a sudden, our Prime Minister at the time said we need to promote British values, which is something fine if you want to, but they couldn't define exactly what British value was. It's just that there was a sense that there needed to be British values. Okay, so sometimes when you can't pinpoint something, is that you put a slogan and say British values, but we've had to actually define what it is. So here again, British Islam, I think this is from snippets of understanding that, because Britain and countries in Europe are very unique, because they don't have this political influence, Islamic political influence, to implement a certain form of Islam, that they have this flexibility and this variety and so on. So what they will do is they will look to their place and they apply Islam, and they will do it without any, for example, overarching power to enforce anything. So it gives the scholars, and not just scholars, free thinkers who consider themselves Muslims, to now say this is how we should implement Islam. For example, Islam, even for those who study from a classical perspective, we realize that Islam came to provide progression in the society, to make it progressive. So, for example, the issues of giving women rights and so on. So sometimes you may find, look, Islam in Britain is progressive and it's a British form of Islam. Why? Because we find women are treated different to, say, for example, some classical interpretations of how women should be, like their place should be as such and such. Whereas we find in the UK, it's practiced different. So maybe this is what gives the perception that there is a British Islam, but there's definitely no particular agenda amongst the Muslims to promote anything as such.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think we can now talk more about the Islamic religious education in Britain. What are the main issues, the outstanding issues of Islamic religious education in Britain, and how is it carried out? How is Islamic religious education carried out? I mean, you just talked about it actually, that you don't have a formal curriculum or formal schools in that sense, but you have supplementary schools. So how is this organized? How is it carried out? Who decides on the curriculum, on the schools to be opened? So could you start with how religious education is carried out actually, and then what the issues around Islamic religious education in Britain are?
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I mean, I think it came about from this word which is called maslaha, like an interest within the community, public interest within the community itself, to want to provide because of the children, because of the sense of they should have. I mean, everyone believes there's certain core teachings that every Muslim should have, especially if they need to pray. So they need to know the Quran, they need to know Arabic as well. So this came about as maslaha, as an interest, necessity as well. Okay, some may even say darura, necessity in the community. So it came about not because, for example, it is state sponsored in any way, or the state has a concern, because this country believes in religious freedom. You're able to practice your religion freely, and it's allowed for this religion to manifest in the public. The only time they would interject is if there was any public concern, so it affects the public in any way. So hence this issue of terrorism and so on, but we can come to that another point. Sticking to the Islamic education, so it came from within the Muslim community, it came organically from within the Muslim community. So maybe you find, for example, the early Islamic schools were set up because certain scholars felt there's a need, and they have the expertise to provide it to the community. So you find these early scholars set up these schools. Other cases, you may find the parents of the children in the community, because they have links to the mosque, maybe ask the mosque, can you not have supplementary schools within the mosque? So if they're going to normal school, because it's the legal requirement for that, they should have schooling. If they go to normal state school, then they can come in the evening and maybe study in the madrasa or the weekend. So this is how it came about, like quite organically within the community. We're at the state now, though, where the requirements have been met, and now it's developing how this is provided to the community. So, for example, you can have the first option, which is supplementary school. People go to normal state schools, and then they study in the evening or weekend, or others go to faith-based school, or others, the third option, which I haven't put there, is homeschooling, by the way. So homeschooling. So this is, again, you fulfill the legal requirement in the UK if you teach your children at home, but again, you're liable to be inspected. Yes, inspected to see if you're actually providing that teaching to children. So what we find now is the predominant way of Islamic education is still these supplementary schools, where people send them the children on the weekend and in the evenings. But now we have also got well-established faith-based school, Muslim or Islamic schools, whether they be primary, which is below the age of 11, and secondary, which is often considered high school elsewhere.
When did these faith-based schools start? Approximately.
Approximately, you have them starting from like the late 80s, 90s, so on. So they're established from then. But you have, for example, coming up to the millennium, you find the proliferation of schools now up and down the country because of it. But they have this sort of establishment within the last 20 to 30 years. And that's primarily because when we find from the first to second generation, those children are growing up, and even their children are now requiring. So it's because the population and the younger population, and there's that demand for our children. So we find it within the last 20 to 30 years.
Yeah, I guess that the supplementary schools are easier to organize. I mean, they're just organized at the weekends and maybe within a mosque or within the community. But with faith-based schools, I mean, they seem to me that they are more formal kind of schools. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, they are definitely more formal, and they definitely strive harder. So when we look to, for example, this school that we give an example, they definitely strive harder to give a more holistic understanding of their perception of Islamic education to the community, and especially to the students that they teach. They take on board, for example, in the curriculum, as we can see here, we can see some core aspects of what it means to be Muslim, moral values and so on. To have, for example, social responsibility. So they mentioned these sort of things, as well as using the Prophet ﷺ as a role model. So so the way they projected the Islamic curriculum, for example, for their school, is that this is something we give holistically, whilst they attain, for example, going back, the elements that's required as a British citizen to study, for example, the core national curriculum subjects. But on top of that, we've given them the tools, for example, Arabic language, correct pronunciation of the Quran, memorization of the Quran, so on. So they're investing the time that they have your child in their facility, in their setting, to give them this holistic understanding. And a lot of people, they will actually pay, because this is not a free service. This is outside of the state-sponsored system, where you pay an extra. You would have to pay a fee for your child to really study like this. I mean, I think now they're moving towards asking the state to actually sponsor some of these schools. But again, there are controversies with regards to that.
Mm-hmm. But there must be some institution giving accreditation to these schools.
Okay, that's a really good point you mentioned, and that's why another point we need to highlight. So why? Firstly, beside the legal requirement, okay, why are we teaching our children, for example, all of these subjects? Because to progress, for example, so we said secondary school is high school. To progress from having completed this and all of these subjects here, to progress to what is known as further education. So from high school, you go into further education. You have to have accredited qualifications. And the only accredited qualifications are, for example, those subjects that are taught via national curriculum or have been accredited. For example, you can have a GCSE in Arabic, okay, and you can have a GCSE, which is a high school certificate for certain subjects, but the actual curriculum itself will not have any accreditation. It will be something that is just seen within the community as something viable and accepted and formalized within the community, but is still informal with regards to the general national education system. So what we find is, hence, they have to supplement. So if you want to go on to further education, if they were to study to become an alim and so on, that title itself will not account to anything within the current education system. So they couldn't even progress to, for example, further education, which is a college, and thereafter university with those qualifications. So it's not accredited in any way.
Okay. So my next question is actually in a way related to that. I was going to ask if there are any different approaches among Muslim communities towards the Islamic religious education. So maybe you have a council or a board, that kind of thing in the community, to decide what kind of topics or subjects you're teaching the children in these schools. So is there then a difference in each community, or do they have similar approaches, or are they in a way also in contact with each other and share experiences maybe?
I mean, initially, I would say that each of these schools, they start off as what is known as independent schools. So they're not state schools, they're independent private schools, but they will have, because the fact there's a common goal to serve in the community, that they will have, for example, certain organizations. So you may find a Muslim association of teachers, Muslim association of schools. So you find these, but these are just umbrella organizations where the actual members are the people who are part of individual institutes. And maybe you find one institute, because it's very popular, will expand and will have several different branches, but it's not to say that necessarily what they will promote is uniform throughout this umbrella organization. Rather, they will come together and they will address maybe some of the concerns in the community in regards to teaching, how teaching is done, and if there's any way to collaborate. But generally, each of these institutes, they're very much independent, just like the mosque are, by the way. Just to show you how the ethos of the Muslim community is in the UK, the mosques are very much independent. Okay, they're very much independent entities. Maybe they come together under umbrella organization, but the committee and the people that are part of the committee, they run it as a separate entity altogether. And that's pretty much how education is in the UK as well.
Okay, so and is there a difference between different types of Muslim communities?
I would say there definitely is. I mean, one of the things we've not talked about is that there's different traditions. Okay, so for example, you find people who follow a certain school of, for example, the Darul Ulooms, they would follow a certain curriculum linked to the Asian subcontinent. And then you find, for example, the Jamias, which is another group linked to the South Asian region. They follow a different curriculum. You may find, for example, we've not mentioned this, the sort of sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia, but the Shia would follow, for example, the Hausa curriculum and so on. And another group which is not mentioned here, the Ahmadiyyas, they would have followed their own sort of curriculum as well. So definitely you find communities that have differences in some ideological, or maybe in fiqh as well. They will promote a certain curriculum that serves the community that follows those beliefs and teachings.
Okay, and you mentioned that, I mean, you gave the names London Islamic School and Mayor of London, etc. They all kind of check and control how things are done within these schools.
So, yeah, let's go back to that, because so as Muslims, we feel we're part of, for example, the society. So when we look to this one here, Education Britain, I mean, this obviously also includes Islamic education or Islamic institutes as well. So what you find is the Department of Education is the one, if you go to state-sponsored school, they're the one, or state-funded school, it may be a better word, they're the ones who will oversee all of that. And then you have this body called Ofsted, which goes and inspects different schools. And they inspect, for example, state schools as well as independent schools, even these faith-based school as well. So they'll go to make sure that this standard, because remember, education is compulsory 5 to 18. So they need to make sure a certain standard is set. So they will be going to inspect to make sure generally from a legal perspective that, education needs a vet as a British citizen, okay? But thereafter, regards to regulating the Islamic curriculum, that is within, we would say, in-house. So the institute itself, and again, I'm only using this as an example, the school here, because of the publicly available information, they would monitor themselves the Islamic curriculum. And then those who pay the fees, for example, the parents, they would trust that the school would meet their requirement, which is that they want their child to come out with an Islamic education and a Muslim personality and so on.
Okay. So I think now we can also talk about the prospects of Islamic religious education in Britain. I mean, there has been already a change, I mean, from the communities in schools and mosques, now evolving more to formal schools. What will be other prospect of Islamic religious education be in Britain? Okay, so, and what are the demands of the communities about these schools? And what are the institutional hindrances, maybe, or are there any institutional hindrances? And not only institutional, there might be also some social hindrances.
Yes.
Could you observe any of them? So could you talk about the current situation at the moment and what the demands for the possibilities of Islamic religious education in Britain are?
Okay, I mean, what we can do is really, so going back to this slide, this might explain a little bit. The majority of the Muslims in the UK, they go to state schools. And remember, we said that religious education is part of the curriculum. It's something that they're all taught. But religion is taught in a way where you're taught about different faiths. So when we look to this example here, these schools, they have, by the way, governors that are Muslims, they have teachers that are Muslims and so on. So around the 2013, 2014, there was a lot of controversy in the UK. Firstly, because of there was some fake news. This is the only way to describe it, that Muslims being in these places have influence where they would try to bring in Islamic teachings into the curriculum and thereby somehow Islamicize education in the UK. This was scaremongering. It was Islamophobia. It was all fake in the end because there was no... So looking to these two stories here, we find Birmingham College, they banned students wearing a veil because it was a security risk. And then they overturned this because, again, it infringed on religious freedom. Okay, as long as security measures were met, then so we can see, look, a U-turn here, regards to this college story. And this was the bigger story here, where this so-called Trojan horse, this concept that people will come in disguised in one way, but underneath there's something else, where quite a lot of schools in the Midlands were accused and especially people involved in those schools, were accused of trying to Islamicize the national curriculum in some way, or these facilities which are part of the state funded school system. So there's a lot of this, and this all came about. Why? Because seeing Muslimness as otherness. So, and this is really something that even the teaching unions in the end were against. Why? Because it was formed part of this prevent strategy, where if you prevent these sort of ideologies entering in a community, then we can prevent terrorism. But in effect, they saw it as, no, this is where you isolate a community. In one way, we're telling Muslims you can be multicultural, and then another way we're saying, no, if you start showing you Muslimness, you are seen as being foreign, and that is not what being part of a multicultural society is about. So one of the things we need to look at looking forward is the British society itself going to accept that with Muslim in the community, that we can maybe make, for example, make the curriculum more varied in the sense that it allows more elements that are requirement for a certain community? Is there more scope to allow more latitude, for example, to allow more Arabic to be learnt, maybe more Islamic teaching to be learned? I mean, it depends, because the curriculum is not set in stone. I mean, you can change it over time to meet the demands of a community. So that is one thing that we could look at looking forward. And again, if we have Muslim governors, and governors do have a lot of rights, power in running these schools, they can bring these issues up to be discussed and so on, okay, without the threat of it being taken over or becoming Islamicized. So that's one way forward. The other thing is, when we look to, for example, the schools that we have, we need to ask the question, and I'm going back to this slide here. I mean, who is defining what is Islamic religious education? Okay, we need to have this discussion, because if everyone is doing it independently, okay, because the curriculum has a certain agenda, aims, and outcome. So what are we producing? For example, is really somebody who just learns to become an alim or a hafiz a well-rounded student? Are they someone who is productive, beneficial to society? Or do they become so isolated because the environment where you learn Islamic education is more about culture, more about just maintaining identity? So it could be just the garb, the clothes that you wear, maintaining, for example, segregation between the genders and so on. Or should the Islamic curriculum allow, for example, reflection, for us to reflect what Islamic religion is, and, for example, for us to be critical of it as well? Does it serve the need of Muslims that live in, for example, the 21st century in the West, in the UK? Is there any latitude for this? Or are we just replicating models from the past which may not be relevant to us? So these are some discussions that we do need to have looking forward. Because I give you an example, the second generation may have some links to countries of origin, so they can maybe understand what it means to be, for example, Pakistani Muslim in Britain, or so on. But when you have a generation that have never been to the so-called countries of origin, have no understanding of those cultures, that they live here. So what is Islamic, for example, identity? How is it represented to them? What is Islamic education? How is that represented to them? So I think that is a discussion that I don't believe we've had here, because quite often people are just trying to serve a need as a darura, necessity, rather than to think critically what is actually required.
Okay, so lots of issues actually. And when you said the attitude, I mean, issues need to be brought up by, for example, Muslim governors. Do you think it's not brought up already, or I mean, does it need to be discussed a bit more in detail?
No, I mean, I think, but this is the thing where we have intersectionality of our personality, of our identity. So as a Muslim, you may be happy to be Muslim as well as British, as well as to have an ethnic origin. But whenever you take a role, for example, a school governor, there's certain criteria that you have to meet. So your role is there to be a governor. You may be a Muslim, but at that point, you're looking at for the well-being of the school. So I'm saying that the governor will do the job that they're expected to, which is look after the school, safeguarding, and make sure that the structure of that institute is providing the service required by the community. But that's not to say that, for example, they cannot bring up, or other people that are at these meetings can bring up the requirement of the community. Because why are we still having this disconnect between state school, supplementary school, faith-based school and so on, because it is quite exhausting. Can you imagine these children? They do a full day at normal school, and then they have to go to supplementary school because there's a concept that they need to learn so much Quran, memorize so much Quran, they need to know certain principles of Islam. Whereas we could maybe say, look, is this not exhausting our children? Is this not causing a disconnect? Is there latitude in the current schooling system to have space where we allow people of different faith to learn their religion or aspects of the religion within the confines of the state school, state-funded school, and the space that they have, to give these children more latitude, more space? Otherwise, what we're doing, we're telling them 9 to 3 you go to this school, and then, for example, 5 to 7 this school the weekend, and they're constantly studying, and there's this constant clash. What takes priority?
I had a similar schooling myself, actually. So it was a traveling between two worlds each time. So you leave the German school and then you go to this supplementary type of school.
Yes.
Okay, these were all my questions, but we have some questions here. Would you like to add something, Dr. Islamuddin, or should we go on with the question?
No, I'm quite happy to, maybe because we have limited time as well, is to go for the questions, and if need be, I can summarize some of the points I want a bit later on, if that's okay.
Okay. So I'm not sure how to pronounce the names. Is it Jörg or Jerk? I don't know. Okay, I say Jörg. I would like to ask at the end again. You say, okay, yes, we're waiting for it. We have Said Asadun. Just a second.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I have to go back. Let me just start from the beginning. The first question came from Ertuğrul Gökçekuyu. So he said, how many accredited Islamic theological faculties are there, and what are the challenges?
Okay, so here we go towards accredited, yes. So when we look at the lower level, when I say lower level, if we look at, for example, so primary and secondary school education, and which are between the ages of 5 to 16, and then we look at what is known as further education. So I'll just quickly go to that slide. Maybe that will
the question was about Islamic theological faculties.
Yes, so this is what I'm going to come to, yes, because it's linked to accreditation, okay? So when we look to this slide here, so when it comes to, for example, up to further education, okay, you're pretty much, to get anything accredited, you have to get, for example, GCSEs or A-levels or some sort of vocational course that, for example, the state, to allow you to move forward. Now, when you come to higher education, which is degrees and so on, yeah, you have certain faculties. For example, I can name a few. For example, Exeter University, SOAS University, Birmingham, they have faculties, Durham. So these universities have faculties there which will give you accredited British degrees, which is firmly grounded in the Islamic studies, or even languages that are linked to Islamic studies, for example, Arabic and so on. So that's how you get accredited. Now, when it comes to, for example, independent institutes, you may find some institutes, what they will do is they are independent as an institute, but they will get their degrees accredited by a certain university that is part of the education system. So they may be, for example, get a degree that is, for example, accredited by, say, a university in London or a university in Birmingham, and so on. But they're a separate entity altogether. It just means that the accreditation, so that they would get the credit. Okay, so for example, undergraduate degree, you will get the credit for an undergraduate degree, which will then allow you to move on to postgraduate, whether it's a master's or whether it's a doctorate degree. So you need that sort of accreditation to move on, really. Mm-hmm. So I would say, in regards to the question, they're limited still, unfortunately. They're limited, but they are progressively increasing in numbers because of the fact that these institutes want to be independent, but they can get accreditation by universities that are part of the education system at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next question is there a general agreement among the Muslim groups on how to provide Islamic education, and what are the main controversial areas?
I would say generally there isn't an agreement, because again, the Muslims, if you imagine yourself as a service user, you're going to the service provider who's put out to you, this is what I'm providing. If you want to join me, then do so. There will be a fee. Okay, so there is no overarching body telling them how to set these fees and so on. Rather, they may be, for example, because of public interest, the government would want to know that their safeguarding is happening. The children are protected in that environment, so they will send inspectors to check. But in the end, there's no agreement There may be some form of uniformity because there's a certain role model. So in Islamic school, you would expect that the child who goes to an Islamic school would know some Quran, would know some, for example, Hadith, would know some, for example, memorize some Quran, some Arabic language, and so on. So these are the things we as parents, or the parents in the community, they would want their children to learn this. So there will be some uniformity with regards to that. But that's not to say that there is something that has been agreed by these different institutes. Rather, there are these, and I would say there are these good organizations, because they are working for the benefit of the Muslim community. They come together, but I think more work could be done, definitely.
Okay, and then we have a question from Jörg Bogumil. He said, how is polyphony managed in Muslim groups' relations with the state and their claims regarding religious education?
So was that polygamy, or was that polygamy?
Polyphony.
Polyphony, just expand on that. I didn't quite understand that question. If you can expand on that question just a little bit.
What's polyphony managed in the Muslim groups' relations with I think if I interpret the question, there's not just one voice within the Muslim groups.
Yes.
And how are their relations with the state and their claims regarding religious education, since there's not just one voice?
Yeah, that's fine. I understand that. Thank you for that. So again, you can have different bodies that may want to represent the Muslim community. So one such organization can be, for example, the Muslim Council of Britain. Okay, they're an umbrella organization. They serve different aspects of the Muslim community. Initially, they were involved in, for example, the network of mosques that are around the country, but now they are addressing other issues as well. So that can be one such organization that will have people that will represent the Muslim community. Now, the government is aware that if they deal with the MCB, it does not necessarily mean that they're dealt with all of the community, all the Muslim communities, because like we said, we're not homogenous, we're heterogeneous. So in that case, for example, they may bring 2 or 3 different factions or different groups together, for example. So you may find, for example, some people, they follow a certain curriculum, but they may bring people who follow, for example, in particular, the Sufi tariqa. So they will bring their scholars in to discuss this. So the government is fully aware that the Muslims are not the same. Sometimes they would address them the same, for example, in regards to halal meat, which they, would treat Muslims as uniform, but in specific issues, they may want to speak to particular representatives or those that they feel are influential or have some sort of position in that community, and they would have that sort of dialogue with them.
Okay. We have another question from Ertuğrul Gökçekuyu, and he says, in most European countries, Muslims don't have a high sense of belonging. How come British Muslims have a higher sense of Britishness?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question to ask. And I think that's what I wanted to put forward today, because I'm sure you're going to find when you discuss the other countries that you may not actually get that same picture, the sense of belonging of being British, and I wanted this to come across. That's not to say that the Muslims in the UK are not proud of being Muslims or their ethnic origin, but they're quite comfortable to say that they're British Muslims as well, because they've invested themselves and their time and their family in this community, and they feel a sense of belonging here. And that because fundamentally it's really to do with the policies. In the 1970s onwards, multiculturalism was the policy in the UK, which meant that people who come from different parts of the world, and they could keep their ethno-religious identity. Okay, so for example, I don't want to stereotype, but you can go to parts of the UK and the people will still wear salwar kameez, which is something that you wear in a hot country, maybe South Asia, and they wear that in the streets, and there's no problem with that. And obviously, one of the trends that's happened in the UK is people who have been to Arab countries, they wear the thobe now. So even though thobe is not associated with, and I'm not in a thobe at the moment, but majority of the time as an imam, I wear a thobe, as you can, and my hat as well. But I'm not. I'm quite comfortable wearing this as well as my thobe as I need to. And I think this is something generally comes from this being comfortable with your identity. And I think it's also in the ethos of how Muslims teach the next generation, for example, that you can have these multiple identities. It's only when you feel there's a sense of clash. Now, when there's a clash, you need to identify what is causing that clash. Okay, is it the institutes? Is it because the institutes are causing, or is this this inner conflict that I have with my identity and feeling a sense of belonging somewhere else? So all of these sort of dialogues, I think, has happened. You can find a lot of literature about Muslim British identity where people have gone through this sort of conflict. And I think also because we've had long-standing people in the UK for a while, and in huge numbers, say from 1945 onwards, that we have that presence in the UK.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question from Zeynep Canturk, and she says, is it true that Mohamed Salah, the Liverpool Football Club player, has increased the number of Muslims in the country?
Okay, so I'm not going to reveal which team I follow, okay? But see, here again, a Muslim personality is a great representative of some of the dialogues that we're having in the community. So when Mo Salah, okay, came to the Liverpool Football Club, football itself has its own inherent problems, especially rooting at racism, okay? But so for years in the UK, we had trouble with black players, okay, who were singled out by people in the fans who would get taunted out and so on. So there is still this inherent problem in football, which is known as soccer around the world, of racism. So boot out, racism, kick out racism. They've had this. So similar like this, we said this Islamophobia is where Muslims show their identity, is a form of racism. But when we found the success of Mo Salah, and that's primarily due to his own skills and qualities that he has, the fact that he's a prolific goal scorer and a sportsman, he's turned around people's mindset to say, look, okay, we don't just see him as a Muslim anymore. He's a great footballer who happens to be Muslim, and so people were chanting his name and normally people have been to football clubs, and I'm sure in Turkey, the words often said against the rivals are not great and so on. So yeah, they were shouting good words of praise, and then somebody said, like, if he scores, or some people were saying that if Mo Salah scores any more goals, then I'll become Muslim. I mean, it may be in jest, but even to have that sort of dialogue and discourse out there is amazing. So there's positivity there from that, and there's signs of positivity. But then again, it's down to perception. How do we identify a person? Okay, was it Muslim? Is it a footballer? Is he so on and so on?
Okay.
But yeah, he has some positive effects. But that's not to say the rival teams are all supportive of him. But I think as a neutral person, I think he has been more positive than negative, definitely.
Okay. I would like to thank Irfan Erdogan. He's shared a paper on Islamic education in England that he's written. And there's a I don't know if it's really a question. Saeed, did I miss something? Please write it again if I missed it. He said, is it possible to speak on a Muslim diaspora in Britain, or can we talk about the diaspora of each nation state?
So to speak about, yeah, I mean, the thing is, again, you can speak about the different diaspora that are here by all means, but then you're just going into history. When they came, did they integrate within the existing Muslim community, or did they carve out their own identity and so on? It's a very interesting topic, because I give you an example. If you were to come here in the 70s and 80s, you would be faced predominantly by, for example, South Asian, but now these same areas have people who are from North Africa, for example, Europe, Eastern Europeans, Turkey, Middle East, and it's totally different altogether. So yeah, it is. You could talk about them as different diasporic communities, but in general, how did they integrate into the community? For example, when did they establish their own sort of identity? For example, or did they? Because I give you an example, a mosque. We say that if the South Asian community initially set up the first mosque, and then you find communities came from North Africa, Middle East, did they set up their own mosque, or did they just assimilate with the current mosque system and so on? I mean, something that you could look at, but obviously in the time we have today, we couldn't really expand on that more than that I have done today already.
Okay, and we have one final question from Irfan Erdogan, and he says, what do you think about a common curriculum for Muslim faith schools? And what is the challenge to make a common curriculum for these schools?
Okay, so that's a very good question. I think we need to look at the current curriculum and think about what does it mean to give our children Islamic education, okay? What are the emphasis that we need to place? For example, so I have links to supplementary school, weekend schools. So I see what is taught, and quite often the parents, all they want is they bring the children, say, for example, these Islamic schools or supplementary schools, and say, I want my son or daughter to become alima, hafiza. No other questions thereafter, which means there's a set replication of what they expect. He has to memorize the Quran, or he has to learn these books of hadith here. But we don't ask, what is the purpose of this knowledge? How is that going to affect the person individually and their identity and personality, and how are they going to contribute to the society, Muslim community, and the wider society? That question is not asked. So the thing is, you put this child who will not be necessarily have the capacity to make the choice. For example, if you bring a child to school or supplementary school at the age of 5 and 7 or 9, and you say you have to learn this, okay, and the child may learn this, but what are they going to, and how are they going to utilize that information within that education that they have? Do they understand the greater purpose behind this? And I think this is the sort of discourse that we need to have now, because otherwise what we will be doing is just replicating models, but are those models suitable for today?
Okay, so thanks a lot. I think that would be all from the audience, and I would like to thank you a lot. Would you like to sum up briefly what you have said?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, again, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak about this. As you mentioned in my bio, my speciality is that I am an academic of law, so I do social legal studies. But I thought, because of the general nature of this topic, to give an overview. So, and obviously being someone who is British Muslim as well, to give part of my insight of this community, as well as the fact that I've taught Islamic studies, been an imam, so, and researched the topic as well. So I thought I'd just give you a general overview. We know with the time limits, we couldn't really cover all of the topics, but hopefully this will, for those the listeners that are watching us today, or maybe follow it later on, cause for us to think about really the way forward as Muslims, wherever we may be, but particularly if we have a certain responsibility when we're part of a minority in a community, to represent Islam the best way we can, and obviously to be critical, to see that if it's something useful, beneficial for the society that we live as well. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being critical at all.
Okay. Then thanks a lot. It was a pleasure to have you here, and I learned a lot. And as I said, we are looking forward to have the workshop on these issues too in the summer. Maybe we will see you and some others again during the workshop. Yes,
I'm looking forward to that. Thank you very much. And I will be following these webinars as well, other speakers, because it is interesting to hear about people from all around Europe as well. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks. Okay, goodbye all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.